Hi. How's everybody doing this morning? I don't know how a girl can follow the mindful raisin. I'll try to, I guess, speak very consciously and slowly and sort of continue the feeling of peace and contentment that I picked up from my raisin. And also just to say thank you and take a moment of gratitude for all the hard work and expense to get me here from New York. I particularly want to thank Peter and Alex for their incredible sort of evangelism and hosting, and also to Amy for working out all the incredibly difficult and annoying details of getting me here from there. So I appreciate the invitation. I also really appreciate everybody being here and on time. In weather that every single person I've met in the last 2 days tells me is not normal. Where we live, so everybody's like, it's not like this normally. So I appreciate people giving up literally their moment in the sun to come here to hear me talk about my research. So thanks so much for being here. And I think we're going to have a great discussion over the course of the day, and I hope what I offer here really just opens that conversation. I feel like I have a lot of great questions, not always a lot of terrific answers, particularly in places where I'm not from, where I'm not working, where I'm not involved in movements or teaching. So I'm really interested in the work that you're doing here and how it relates and how it resonates with the work that we've done in Troy, New York. So I'll be speaking primarily today about this book that Peter has kindly put up at the front of the room here, Digital Deadend, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age. But to understand Digital Deadend, you have to understand a little bit about me and a little bit about how the book was produced. So the book is based on 4 years of participatory action research. And all that means is doing research with people, located in and grounded in community, rather than doing research on people under a bell jar as if they were experimental subjects. So the folks that I worked with had input all the way along from the research questions to the dissemination of the work. And it was produced in a community of people who are based in the YWCA of Troy Cohoes. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but I just want to acknowledge the beginning design group is in that picture to your right. And this is a group that was called WIMSIM, Women at the YWCA Making Social Movement. This is our original sort of design and research group. So I always try to acknowledge at the very beginning of any talk I give that this was collaborative work all the way through. I'm the one who gets to travel and talk about it because I'm the one who put it between covers. But that it was a collaborative process all the way through. So this was the sort of extraordinary group of people who I worked with to make the book. So the YWCA of Troy Cohoes is a really interesting organization. It's there on your left. And the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, is a women's membership movement that with the goals of eliminating racism by any means necessary and the empowerment, particularly the economic empowerment of women and girls. It also in Troy is what we call an SRO, or a single room occupancy housing, which basically just means sort of dorm-like rooms, shared bathrooms and kitchens down the hall. At the time I was working there, it was approximately $250 a month, so it's like 180 quid maybe a month for the rent, and about 80% of the people who live there were getting some help from the state or from the municipality with their rent. So the people who live at the Y, the women who live at the Y, are really struggling to meet their basic needs. And they're resourceful, engaging, brilliant women, but they're really struggling with meeting their day-to-day needs. It's situated in Troy, New York, which is there on your right. Troy is a small city of about 50,000 people. That is, I just did the math to make sure I had it in kilometers, 240 kilometers north of New York City on the Hudson River. And it has a lot of the problems that are common to small post-industrial cities. Right? So declining population, legacies of racial and gender discrimination, increasing income inequality, and high levels of unemployment and poverty. It's also an incredibly resourceful city with an amazing social justice history. so Troy was really central to the abolition movement in the United States. It was the first place where there was a school that taught girls the same curriculum as boys, now called the Emma Willard School, then called the Troy Seminary, strangely enough. And it's also the home of the first sustained female labor union in the United States, the Troy, it's a long name, Troy Collars, Laundresses, and Stitchers Union. So Troy is the place where they invented the detachable shirt collar and shirt cuts. Right? So there's like an apocryphal story about this woman who got sick of laundering her husband's shirts and ripped the collar off because it was the only thing that really ever got dirty. And she was like, I'll wash this. And thus the detachable shirt collar was born. And they made gazillions of them in Troy. And it was a skilled work, the creation of these and the laundering of these. And I could tell you more about the labor history of Troy, but I'll skip it for now. Fascinating story. So it's this incredible town, right? It has this incredible social justice history, this very diverse population, economically, racially, in terms of age. But it's really struggling with some very serious issues common to sort of post-industrial cities. So a little bit about me is important, too, to sort of understand how the book turned out the way it did. So I came of age as an activist, really, in the early 1990s, early to mid-1990s in the San Francisco Bay Area of California in the United States, just at the time that the dot-com bubble was really gaining steam. And so as a sort of single, middle-class white woman with a fair amount of privilege, a really good education, it was kind of an exciting time to be there, right? It's funny now, I had these crazy technical skills, right? I could write HTML, which sounds like a really funny thing to say now, but at the time it was like crazy. I wrote my first website to the Mosaic browser, which really dates me. So I had these skills that were really of great use. And I was working, as a consultant, and had a lot of time to do other stuff. And I was writing this one of the first cyber feminist online magazines, and running around being, too cool for school in the San Francisco Bay Area. But the other half of my life was that I was working in economic justice and anti-poverty work. And so at the same time that I was sort of running around with all these high-tech folks who were pretty convinced that the internet was going to solve all of our social problems, within like 18 months, right? Like racism, economic inequality, like the internet was going to fix it all. The other half of my life, I was watching, public housing disappear from San Francisco. The rents tripled in 2 years. And the statistic that I use most often to talk about the change there is the African American population of San Francisco in 2010 was literally half what it was in 1980. Right? So there was these really rapid changes taking place in San Francisco at the same time that every time you went out to talk to the other people you knew who were making electronic online zines, the conversation was all about how the internet was going to level power, level hierarchies, make us able to share power, and to share economic wealth as well. It's a really interesting moment, right, which made me a little bit crazy, I had a little bit of a schizophrenic experience. And it's what basically led me to run away from San Francisco. So I packed up my 1981 Volvo station wagon, and I drove across the country to this little town in the Northeast, and I was like, I won't have to deal with that here. Globalization. Quick work to my plans of living a non-IT revolution lifestyle when, 18 months after I moved there, the municipal governance rolled out this new economic development plan that was called Tech Valley. Right? I was like, and they were explicitly basing it on the experience of Silicon Valley, right? That's why it was called Tech Valley. And I was like, come on. So clearly there was something going on here that I felt like I really needed to make sense of, that I was trying to get my sort of head around. But the framework that I had when I entered this work at the Y might be something that you guys are pretty familiar with. And there's a very bad cartoon that I drew of it. This is basically a cartoon of the digital divide, right? This idea that there's a group of folks who have access to technology, to technological resources and skills, as well as the tools of the information revolution. There's a group of people who do not have that access. And so the policy solutions are all about that arrow in the middle, right? It's all about how do we pull people from the have-not side over to the have side, or how do we like huck the technology over the chasm, hoping it doesn't land on anyone in the have-not side, and make sure that they have access to these resources. And this is very much how I came to this work, right? I came up in the Community Technology Center movement. This is very much sort of the model that we had. Now, the problem with this model is that it assumes that women who live in the YWCA community, right, these folks who are struggling to meet their $250 a month rent, would be the very people who would not have access to technology, right? This is potentially the best place to do this work, and that's why I got involved with the Y. So, imagine my surprise then to find out that I was really and completely wrong. So contrary to assumptions in digital divide policy and activism, this idea that there are information poor communities, information technology was really a ubiquitous presence in the lives of women in the YWCA, especially in the low-wage workplace and in their interactions with the social service system, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the real lesson from this work is the way you experience IT, whether you find it sort of liberating or exploitative, empowering or disciplinary, really depends on who you are and how much power you have. What, like, social scientists would call your social location, your position in sort of the web of power relations, particularly along the lines of race, class, and gender. So what I want to do in sort of the middle third of my talk here is I want to talk a little bit about what I learned from the women in the YWCA community about the relationship between technology and inequality, and how that led us to think differently about technology education. So one of the most important things I learned is, despite digital divide policy's emphasis on job training, right, the idea was that people needed high-tech skills to be relevant in the IT economy, women in the YWCA or Troika host community already had high-tech jobs. And in fact, 2/3 of the women who lived at the Y had been working in IT or were currently working in IT while living at the YWCA. But they weren't often the jobs that we think of first when we think of high-tech work, because primarily they were working in call centers and also in data entry warehouses. So the problem was not that women in the YWCA community lacked access to high-tech jobs. The problem was that the jobs that they had access to had deeply inadequate wages. There's a woman I worked very closely with in our design group for a long time who was working for an internet service provider local to Troy, and she was doing overnights, so basically backups and security stuff. And she was receiving, she worked about 30 hours a week and receiving $50 a week under the table for her work, right? Which is clearly illegal and unusual. But not unheard of at all. And the reason that she was doing it is that she felt like tech skills were so important that she put in sort of this sweat equity in order to get to someplace else with the skills where she thought she could make some more money. It is important, I think, to point out that one of the reasons she could do this, work these overnights, and for this low pay, is that she wasn't currently caring for her children. She had lost custody of her children. And if she had had her children with her, that wouldn't have been possible. Right? You can't work overnights, and you can't work for less than minimum wage if you're supporting your children. Also, the employment relationship in many of these jobs was temporary, contingent, and often unsustainable, particularly for workers with children. So in call center work and data entry, warehouse work, swing shifts and split shifts are really common, right? So working overnights or working from 8 o'clock in the morning till noon and then going home for 4 hours and coming back and working from 4 to 8. Again, which is like a perfect recipe to never see your children. And if you don't have another person in the house to care for your children, again, it makes it impossible to do. There are a number of negative health impacts that people are probably familiar with around visual dysfunction and also repetitive motion injuries. And one of the most interesting things I found about this work is just how very endemic and deep monitoring and surveillance of employees are in these jobs. So there's another woman I work really closely with who told me in an interview that she'd been working entering entering information for an insurance company. And she told me once that she had sort of opened up a browser window on her computer while she was at work to see if she had enough money in her bank account to get a sandwich at lunch. And in her own words, the bloodhounds in the IT department were at her desk within like 80 seconds, and were like, "What are you doing on the internet? This is work time. You're using this for private time. Like, we're docking your paycheck, for 5 minutes, right?" So the surveillance that IT makes possible makes the sort of increments of punishment smaller and smaller, right? And in an interesting way, also forces people to sort of internalize their own surveillance on the job. So another woman I worked closely with was entering bids for state contracts for New York State. And she described her work environment for me. And so she was working at a monitor in keyboarding, and there was at the bottom right-hand corner of her screen a flashing red number that started at 70 and counted down. And the number basically counted down every time she entered a new bid. And at the top of each hour, it reset, right? So it started at 70, counted down until it hit the last minute of the hour, and then reset at the top of each hour. And I said, well, how many have you been able to do in an hour? But she was really prized for her speed. She had been very quickly advanced at this job because of her speed. And she said, 30. 30 was her fastest, the most she could get in an hour, right? So there's this sort of impossible standard that people are constantly comparing themselves to. And also, though, in the U.S. at least, in many poor working class communities, you can still find call centers and data entry warehouses, and they're, in fact, really big employers. Increasingly, this work's been globalized as well, been outsourced. So this is actually women in Ghana processing insurance forms for Aetna, an insurance company, which monitors their work in real time from New York. So actually what that means is, since Ghana is 5 hours ahead of New York, that in order for the surveyors to work normal hours, 9 to 5, the women in Ghana work from 2 until 10, right? So again, responsive to the sort of the needs of the overseers, less than the needs of the workers there. So that's one place, one thing that I did not expect to see, right? My assumption coming into this was that I had a lot of technology skills, a lot of access to technology resources that I could make available to people who didn't have them. And luckily, they were kind enough to correct me after I had been there for about a year, like desperately trying to get people to come to programs, and they kept not coming, and finally I was like, "Why don't you come to my stuff?" And they were like, "Oh, honey, sit down." And they were like, "Oh, pumpkin, your questions are all really boring and have nothing to do with our lives. Let us explain to you why your questions are boring and have nothing to do with our lives," which I'm immensely grateful for, because it opened up this whole new sort of world of thinking about this stuff. So the other thing that people talked about, they talked a lot about the low-wage workplace, but the other thing that women talked about was their relationship with technology and how it moderates and mediates their relationship with government. So when women in the YWCA community described to me the most common experience they had with technology, it was actually in the social service office. Right? So in 1996 in the U.S., we had what is called colloquially welfare reform, right? Which is actually the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, often called the PRA, also called welfare reform. And one of the little-known sort of parts of that shift is that it required that all social service offices computerize. And primarily that computerization has been in records keeping, but also in intake, right? So your very first experience of the social service system is often, as the women in the YWCA community described to me, sort of the butt end of a computer, right? That you are going through some incredibly difficult experience, whether it's an experience with illness, with homelessness, coming out of a drug addiction, getting out of an abusive relationship, so any number of things that are really life changers, you sort of get it together to try to request some help from the state, and the very first thing you see is, this back of a screen and a caseworker hiding behind it and sort of popping their head around the edge and being like, "You're not in the system," and then going back behind the computer. Has anybody seen Wizard of Oz? People have seen Wizard of Oz. So there's this moment where everybody gets to the end of the Yellow Brick Road, and they get to Oz, and there's this huge door, and out of the huge door is that little bitty door, and the guy with the big mustache comes out, right? He's like, "Oh, wait." He slams the door, and they have this moment of intense disappointment, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of like that, except for on the other side of the door is, access to food for your children, or a place to stay if you're living in the street, right? So this is a really powerful moment when that door swings shut, and the sort of representative of that door is the back of a computer monitor. And so women talked to me a lot about that being a really important technological experience for them, and being, in fact, they described it as the most important technology training they got. Was that technology was there to survey their behavior, to shut them out of possible resources, and to really put a barrier between them and government. And I think that's actually really important to take seriously. And that actually, and we can talk about this later, that's actually where my work has gone since then, is I now mostly study the computerization of public services in the United States, and it's super fascinating. And I'm happy to talk about it at length later if people are interested. So for women in the Y community, I call this the real world of information technology. Rather than being technology poor, women in the YWCA community had copious experience with technology in their everyday lives, right? In the workplace, in their relationship with government, in education, in their neighborhoods, and in their everyday experience. And what I'd like to sort of pose is the challenge to take this experience seriously, right? Which is not to say, that like computers the man, and it's another thing that has like its foot on the neck of the poor working class. Not quite that, but also that we have a different way of thinking about technology as being neither sort of the ultimate sort of end, the ultimate sort of light bulb, or the sort of big brother evil, but something that is much more ambivalent than that, something that is unfinished, right? And that we actually have to push towards social justice if we want it to serve social justice. So one of the questions I had after doing this work is, if this was the real world of technology for women in the YWCA community, how did so many policymakers and even so many activists get it so wrong? Bless you. And I think one of the issues is that the scholarly work and even some of the activist work we do around technology and inequality is often deeply disconnected from the reality of poor and working women's everyday experience. There are powerful incentives to not ask questions about who benefits and who pays for technological change. And one of the things I say in the book is that we're often victims of magical thinking, right? Magical thinking is common in very small children and schizophrenics. And it basically means that you believe that if you think of something hard enough, that it will materialize in reality, right? So I want a pony, I go to bed at night, I'm thinking pony, 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 and if I think about it hard enough, I open my eyes. Pony, right? That's magical thinking. So we have kind of a magical thinking about technology often, particularly in the United States, and I'd like to talk to you about how you interpret that here in your own context over the course of the day. We have this blind faith that technology will somehow magically level the playing field, will equalize social relations, and democratize the world, right? So the idea that IT will magically solve our problems sometime in the future, whenever that big killer app is finally invented, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or, nanobytes or whatever. The problem with that is that it really keeps us from addressing the real problems we face in the now. So we tend to think about technological change sort of like the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? You remember this scene in the movie where it's like, we're all monkeys, we're all monkeys, we're all monkeys, thing from space lands on Earth and humans, right? So we tend to think of that next big technological breakthrough as the monolith, right? Twitter starts the Arab Revolution, right? Of course, Twitter didn't start the Arab Spring, right? It's an important tool in, in a quiver of important tools that started a people's movement, right? But Twitter certainly didn't do it by itself. So what I want to challenge us to do today is think of technology in Andrew Feenberg's terms. And he says technology isn't a destiny, it's a site of struggle. So I think of technology not simply as a tool for organizing, but as a social justice issue in its own right. So we can't assume that IT is an unqualified good. The answer to can technology serve social justice is, of course, yes. But first we have to ask, technology for what? Towards which ends? By whom? And in whose interests? So in order to guide our work at the Y, we developed an approach that I call popular technology. And that's the last thing I'm going to talk about for just about 10 minutes is how popular technology is different and the projects that we came up with, just to give us sort of a place to start. How are people feeling in terms of energy? It could be like occupy twinkle fingers if you're doing okay. Ooh, look at you. It's early in the morning. You're all very strong. I appreciate it. So basically, the idea behind popular technology is rather than teaching technological skill to those who are deemed sort of technology deficient or information poor, we gather everybody's insight into their own personal experience into what it means to be a sort of critical technological citizen, right? Because we're kind of all, as Donna Haraway's terms, we're kind of all already cyborg, right? There's no way you can separate yourself from the technological scene. And so what the great news with that is that we're actually all experts about what technology means in our own lives. It doesn't mean that you can necessarily open up a Unix shell and and run some open source software to create a server. But you do know how your cell phone has affected your relationships with other people. And those are some of the really interesting questions, right? So we're all experts in technology in our everyday lives. And then you build engaged technology projects from there. Rather than starting with, say, Microsoft Excel, let's all learn spreadsheets, and then the content comes later. Rather than starting with the software and then trying to cobble on a social justice issue, you start with the social justice issues and then see which tools are appropriate, right? Which seems very simple, but it's something that we rarely do, right? Is start with the issue and let the technology come later. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 projects that we did at the Y. There's a dozen projects that I talk about in the book, so if any of these pique your interest, I talk about them at much greater length in the book. That's the only plug. Bye. The only plug. Or download it for free. Up here it's available. But do read it. And then I'm going to offer just a couple of sort of thoughts on what this means for teaching and learning. So the first project that we did was building a resource that largely was about building capacity at the Y. So we built a community lab, a community technology lab at the Y. The thing that's really interesting about the lab is that the process that we used to create it was sort of story all the way through. We had 3 months of meetings before we ever bought a computer or got a computer to make sure that we were building something that folks in the YWCA community would use, would feel like it was their own, would make sense in the context of their lives. After the lab opened, we had 3 more months of meetings to sort of have some kind of feedback on how people were feeling about it. One of the things that was really interesting is that despite sort of all of this really intense participatory design that went into it, nobody used the thing, right? We had this big party to open, we had snacks, we had all of these great classes, we had all this great stuff going on. And it was pretty rarely used. And so a couple of months after we opened, I made sure to go around and be okay, why is everybody coming to the lab? Because people were nice and they always told me when I screwed up, and I screwed up all the time. So I went around and kind of did a survey of why isn't this working for you? Why aren't people coming? And people were very nice. They're oh, it's such a great resource. Oh, we're so proud to have it. Oh, it's so great. And still, they never came. And I was okay, something's going on here. And so I did this survey. And what people said was really interesting, which is the most important role in the lab was a sort of community translator who would act as a hostess to get people across the doorway, right? Get people into the lab and using stuff in ways that made sense for their lives. And so what we were able to do, because of that the Y was residential, is we were able to give people rent credit. So some kind of credit towards their monthly rent to act as lab hostesses. And once we had people who actually lived in the Y acting as hostesses in the lab, it just went from like zero use to like full use almost overnight. And so this is like a schedule. You can tell, it was open from 7 in the morning to 9 at night, right? And there was no staff member in it the entire time. And so it was a very popular resource for a really long time. But not until that insight of like what really mattered was having somebody who looked like them in the lab to say like, oh, this is not a big deal. Like, come in and like, we'll play guitar. You don't have to use these silly boxes if you don't want to. But then that offered all sorts of opportunities to do technology training, right? Like, let's sit around and play guitar. Oh, wait, do you want to record that song? Let me take you to the Mac, and we'll show you how to record and edit music, right? So again, it's starting with people's material needs, everyday material needs, and then picking up the technology skills after. There's plenty of opportunities to do that. The second project I want to talk about for a minute was called the Women's Resource Directory. And this was started out fairly straightforward. The idea was to create an online directory of social services that were available in the three cities, the three-city area where we live. It's organized by, you could keyword search it, or is organized where you could sort of drill down to find the thing that you need. The thing that made this different from most resource directories is that we programmed in a talkback section, which was basically a way for people who are using social services to comment on the quality of services they were receiving. So people would say things like, blankety blank maternity services in Albany says that they have free baby clothes and baby furniture. You take 3 buses to get there, 8 months pregnant, and you show up, and they say, oh yes, it's free, except what you have to do is you have to take our parenting classes. For each parenting class, you earn mommy dollars, and then you can buy the furniture and the clothes with the mommy dollars. Which I'm not even going to say is a bad or a good plan for social services, but if you're 8 months pregnant and have gotten on 3 buses to try and get a crib, this is not going to be a good day for you, right? So that's like one of the comments that showed up on the talkback section. This predictably got the YWCA in a lot of trouble because there's this sort of widespread feeling of, people don't have any other options, so how dare they, evaluate the quality of services we're offering them. So this is basically like, are people familiar with Angie's List? It's basically like a listing of local craftspeople, plumbers and roofers and folks, that you can get feedback from other people who've used them, like non-commercial evaluation. It's basically the same thing, but for social services. It did not last very long. Like, it was up for maybe a year, and then sort of community pressure caused us to shut it down. There is now a resource called 311, which is like you can dial the phone and ask for community resources in the town, but it's only available over the phone, it's only available during business hours, and there's no evaluation, right? So it's just like, well, go to blankety blank maternity services if you need free baby clothes and baby furniture, and there's nobody there to say like, wait, just go really early because you're going to have to take 7 of their classes in order to like a basket, right? So this, I think, was one of the more radical things we did, strangely enough. And finally, we actually looked to build some software. We wanted to make a computer game. One of the early things that we did as WinSim was do a workshop for the community at the Y, where are people familiar with The Sims? This game, EA's game, The Sims. So we were interested in simulation and the relationship between simulation and politics. How they use simulation, for example, to decide where to set welfare cash benefits. They would use in the U.S. policymakers use these simulations to sort of push the benefits down as far as they can without creating sort of social disorder, right? And we're really interested in these sort of invisible systems that really had an impact on people's lives. So we had this workshop early to talk about that, and one of the things we did was play this game, The Sims. And The Sims is basically a like life simulator, right? So you pick a character and you dress them up, and you get a job and find a house and like make out with other Sims and go to parties, and like it's this life simulator. So we played it with close to 100 people came to this workshop, and we played it with about half the crowd. We played it with about 50 people. It was one of the funniest moments I've ever experienced in my life, because all these women living in Hawaii like opened up this game and they were like, "Wait, I started the game with $10,000. Like, who starts the game with $10,000? And it started this great conversation about wealth, right? Like, lots of people start the game with $10,000. And then they're like, wait, if you get a job in this game, somebody just shows up in a car to pick you up to take you to work. I'm like, that's insane. Who does that happen to? And then we're like, well, let's have a conversation about transportation and about equity in transportation. So we had all these great conversations, and out of that, people got really fired up, and they were like, we want to rewrite this game. This game is stupid, and we want to rewrite it based on our own experience. That turned out to be a little bit beyond our abilities in terms of time and just technical prowess. But we did create this really amazing board game that originally was called Life for Real, Money, Sex, and Power. And ended up, we decided to take a slightly more composed title, and we ended up calling it Beat the System. And Beat the System was based on research that we did as a collective with folks, staff, and other people who lived at the Y around the common problems people faced in the social service system. We used the interview material to create a set of 12 composite characters based on those common struggles. So this is, the Jane composite, for example, that deals mostly with medical issues. And then the game posed challenges around, like, this is the situation you find yourself in, how you respond. And so we made a board game out of that, and also a Pago education exercise that we used at a lot of different activist and organizing events around the city. I am happy to say that someone did finally make basically that game. There's a great organization called the Urban Ministries of Durham, North Carolina, and they made a little sort of online flash game called Spec. And this was around the beginning of our current recession in the United States. And the idea basically is you lost your job, you have like $1,000 in savings, your unemployment doesn't kick in for 2 months, like, can you make it? And it gives you like a series of questions to respond to. So it's more limited than what we originally imagined, but I'm really excited that this happened. One of the real benefits of thinking about doing technology education as popular technology is that it allows us to take what I call in the book the real world of information technology seriously. It allows us to meet people where they're at, and to create spaces for all of us to become more critical about the relationship between technology and our everyday lives. So it's not about integrating poor and working people into the information economy, because their labor already supports the information economy and holds up the pipeline for sort of the new creative class. So it's not about teaching technology skill for those who are technology poor. We're all already in the technology scene, whether we want or not. But the real benefit here is this creation of spaces where a very different group of people could come together, could frame these kinds of questions, could shape the intellectual agenda of research and the design agenda of technology. That created something that's often really missing, I think, from both academic research and from technology design. It's very catalytic. It creates new infrastructure. It creates new ways of thinking, and I think it raises really important questions, certainly things I wouldn't have thought of on my own, which is clear in the mistakes that I made and all the correcting that had to happen, right, of my particularly limited worldview, which all of us have. We all have particularly limited worldviews, and that's why doing this collaborative research, I think, can make us smarter. I do want to say really quickly that one of the things that came out of this work was also 2 new organizations. One is called Our Knowledge, Our Power, which is an economic justice and welfare rights group with about 70 members now in the Capital Region. The other is an organization called the Popular Technology Workshops, which uses some of the insights that we learned in this work to help community organizations think more critically about technology and their other social justice goals. So just to wrap up, I know I have about 2 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes. I want to make sure that we have some time to talk. I just want to sort of pose some questions. So, like, what does this all mean for teaching and learning? And specifically for thinking about technology in relationship to teaching and learning. So these are some lessons. This is that workshop where we're playing The Sims right there. People are badly taking notes. I look much younger there. Badly taking notes, and people are laughing and saying that The Sims is ridiculous. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think you can take from this for your own work. The first thing is the thing that makes popular technology different than sort of technology as usual is that we had a social justice framework at the center of our work. And this is a lesson that all sorts of folks in radical education have said over and over and over again, Paulo Freire being the most famous. But, you know, if you're not teaching for social change, then you're teaching for the status quo. What are you teaching for, right? And I want to talk about technology in the same way. If you're not making technology, designing technology for social change, then you're designing technology for the status quo. And, you know, many people are doing just fine with the status quo, and they're okay with that, and okay. But personally, I think we can do better than the social world we currently live in. And if we want to do that, we have to build it in, not just to our government and our pedagogical processes, but also to this sort of material reality of how technology shapes our lives, right? So we have to build it in there from the very beginning. So that's really what makes popular education different from education as usual, and popular technology different than technology as usual. In Our Knowledge, Our Power, that group I was talking about before, just to give you a sort of an example of a social justice framework that we think is interesting, we use an economic human rights framework based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes the rights to job at a living wage, the rights to well-being of a person and their family, protection of mothers and children regardless of birth status, the right to education, and the right to freedom of expression. And the freedom of expression right, I think is really interesting. There's a lot of room there to talk about technology, social justice, and education under that right of freedom to expression. And in fact, a lot of people have started to do that work. So this is just the longer form of that article. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression and opinion. This right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So I think that's an interesting challenge. Like, what does it mean to think about communication as a fundamental human right? What does that mean to us as media makers, as students, as educators, as tech users, as educators? And what role can universities play in securing that human right for the communities in which they're located? The second thing that made the work we do different than sort of technology as usual is that we really prioritize coalition building and bridging across difference. One of the things that's most useful about that human rights framework, it's not without its problems, but one of the things that's most useful about it is it really helps people see similarities across a pretty intense difference. So we work with a national organization in the U.S. called PEPER, the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign. One of the things that's great about PEPER is that they have this terrific definition of poverty, which is if you find yourself unable to meet any one of those economic human rights, right to education, right to affordable, safe housing, right to healthcare, which is a huge issue in the United States, then you're poor, right? Which is really different than the way we think about poverty in the United States, which is there is this $8,000 for an individual poverty line. If you're below it, you're poor. If you're above it, you're middle class. You know, the end. So this new framework of thinking about poverty and economic inequality makes it possible for people to see each other across difference there. And that's created some opportunities for us to do projects like these are, they're actually in reality, they're very small paper zines that we use to talk about people's struggles with their economic human rights in our community. The one there on the left is about healthcare, and the one on the right is about housing. And we've also joined with a national movement called the World Course of Women to have these events that where people give testimony to their experience with economic human rights violations as well. It's exciting. The very first World Court of Women in the United States happened just this year, and there's going to be a national in Philadelphia in October that we're planning for right now. And finally, what makes sort of popular education or popular technology different from education or technology as usual is meeting people where they're at in a way that builds community resilience. And one of the last resources I want to leave you with is this great organization in Detroit, Michigan, called the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition. And that's their website, detroitdjc.org. And they're also working on this economic human rights framework, but specifically that right to communication. And they have 4 principles of digital justice, where they start with access, because that's clearly really important, but they don't end there. Right? They also talk about participation in policy decisions around technology, common ownership of networks and tools, and healthy communities. So they have a really interesting way of talking about what they call healthy digital ecologies, rather than just talking about access. So it gives you a sort of framework for thinking about the relationship between technology and justice for our communities more broadly. And I just want to leave you with 2 questions before I end. The first is, if you buy this, then there should be a social justice framework for thinking about technology and education. You don't have to. We can fight about that. I'm good with it. What should be part of that framework, right? If you think of the relationship between technology and education in that way, what should be part of that social justice framework? And then in second, which technology tools that we have now facilitate teaching and learning across difference, right? Really that forming that connection, that intimacy, that sometimes can be hard with technology tools. So we have technology tools that do that now, and if not, how can we build some better ones? So this is where I'm going to end for now, sort of opening up those questions. I really appreciate your attention. I hope that this has spurred some ideas for us to sort of bounce around as time goes on. And we have about 15 minutes for questions if people want to ask something or just start the discussion now. I'm going to go back to my questions. Yeah.
I'm interested. I run an informal education project in Edinburgh and Manchester, and do you provide templates for how you've brought about or implemented your work?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Yes and no. So in the back of the book, the back sort of third of that book is all appendices. Right. I'm a big fan of the appendices. And it has a number of our workshop curricula. It has meeting minutes. It has all of this stuff about how we actually did this work on the ground. But I have resisted saying oh, this is how you do popular technology, because I really think the very first thing you do in popular technology is meet people where they're at, and you can't do that if you have this framework of no, the first step is this. Peter and I were actually talking about this earlier this week. There's this great place in the U.S. called Highlander Research and Education Center. It's in Newmarket, Tennessee, kind of the home of popular education in the United States. And I went there early in this process, and I was looking for the same thing. I was like, give me your template. And they were like, we don't do that. And I was so frustrated. I was so oh, just tell me how to do it. But I think it's right that they resist that a little bit. And so I've resisted it a little bit too, just to say this was right for us in 2002 in the U.S. in this little town, and it worked for us. But it might be your experience might be quite different. So you need to start with where you're at. But I do think there's some sort of principles that carry over. It's just not quite so systemic as having a checklist of how to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. Thinking about, Martin McAreevy from the University Centre here. Just thinking about some of the early slides and the ideas you were talking about, the role of technology in terms of mediating power relationships and social control. We're increasingly dependent on technology for delivering education, and there's an expectation amongst our students or clients that we will use technology as part of the learning experience. There's a phrase from popular culture in the UK. It says the computer says no. Okay. The idea that something behind the people asking the question and the people delivering the answer, is defining what actually happens in the transaction. Now, I just wanted to ask, do you have anything, any pointers you could give us in terms of where we should focus our efforts as educators in a higher education system to help our students emerge from that codependency and that you know, to go beyond the kind of the computer says no?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a hard
sorry.
one. No, that's okay. Thanks for lobbing that one. I'll see what I can do with it. So the sort of two things that come to mind immediately. So I in the non-activist higher ed teacher part of my life, I mostly teach two areas. I teach science and technology studies, which is really about helping students understand the relationship between science and technology and our social lives. From a social justice point of view. And I teach public policy, right? And both of those areas, really, there's a lot of interesting stuff to do with students around thinking about technology critically. So some of the things I do in the sort of science and technology side, one is I often do, and this might be like even a cliche now, but I think it's actually really interesting. I do a digital fast with my students, where they have to not use any of their technology for like 3 days, and they go crazy. But it brings up this opportunity to really talk about how our relationship with technology frames our lives and frames our experience of lots of different things, including education. And in fact, many of them can't do the fast because we require them to use technology in the classroom, right? So they're like, I have to use the clicker. Like, I'll get marked absent if I don't use the clicker. But that opens a great opportunity to be like, so why do you think we're using the clicker? You know, like what problem does that solve for the educational system, right? And, you know, how does it contribute to learning, and how might there be other ways to do that? I'm also a really big fan of having students look at the very, very mundane, like the very boring thing they haven't thought about, probably haven't thought about at all before. So like my big go-to is sidewalks. We do a whole week on sidewalks. And they're like, this is dumb. And then they're like, oh, this is fascinating, right? So I send them out to like experience 3 different crosswalks in 3 different neighborhoods. And they have to be like very good social scientists and take really good sort of field notes of their experiences, and then they come back and talk about it. And I find that opens up a space to talk about the sort of invisible things in your life that really frame how you interact with other people and how you think about yourself and your physical safety and all this other stuff. So I feel like that opens up, there's a good way of opening up that dialogue, which I think is what you're asking, is like how do you open up a more critical dialogue about, you know, whether technology has agency or not, which, you know, of course it doesn't.
It's almost like, you know, for some sections of society, if it's not on the mobile phone or on the TV, it doesn't exist. So you know, higher education has a special place in terms of moving people beyond that and appreciating, you know, there are people in the room, being mindful, as John said.
And I also think the last thing I'll say on this point is I also think it's really important for us to learn from our students, because also I'm just old, like compared to them in technology years, right? Kind of like dog years, right? 7th grade, normal year. Where I don't always understand what they're using or why they think it's interesting. And so I try really hard to also open up this space where I'm like, you know, there's a technology inventory I do early in my semesters usually, where they have to write down like every technology they interact with and for how long during a day. And that inventory gives me a really great opportunity to be like, oh, I've never heard of, I forget the name of it. There's some like new 6-second video sharing thing that everybody's really into right now. Was it? No, not
Vine.
Vine. Thank you. So I don't know about Vine, you know. I have no clue what that was, but my students taught me, you know. And I find that really useful and really interesting. Like really, like 8 seconds. That's an impressive attempt to get somebody's attention, right? Like how do you do that? So I think also having an open mind about, you know, even though I'm a little bit of a Luddite, like I'll admit to it, I find it really interesting that they have really different brains than I do because of this relationship, and I want to understand that. Right? So again, it's about meeting them where they're at, but also offering an alternative vision of but the things you don't like, that could be different. You know? Yeah.
I always like asking the question, where is the money? And where is it coming from?
and that is, I wonder whether you can elaborate, please, on your funding stream. Is it City Hall, is it state level, is it federal level, and in particular, and I can see one of the Apple Corporation profit machines in front of you, designed in California, built in sweatshops and gyms.
Absolutely.
To what extent is corporate, I would say corporate America, but these are huge, great global corporations. Are they on board with this?
Yeah, and that's a really important question, and something that I struggle with a lot, and I think a lot of us struggle with a lot. Right? These tools are mostly designed for disposal, that are created in horrific conditions, and sold probably at a value far below what their actual social and environmental impact is. And whether that's an appropriate tool to do this work is a big and valid question that I don't have a direct answer to. The funding part I could tell you about. So oddly enough, a lot of our research has been funded by the National Science Foundation. And that was a surprise to me. I did not think I would be attracted to the National Science Foundation. They went through, it's sort of the big funder of, genetics research and, weapons research and all this other stuff in the U.S. So I felt very much like sort of beating swords into plowshares a little bit with that. But they funded me twice. The rest of it, like Our Knowledge, Our Power, is funded through donations and other sort of grassroots fundraising strategies. So most of the work that we did at the Y was just because the Y as an organization was interested in doing that work. And so they, as they could, lent us time and resources to do workshops and space. So it actually was quite cheap. I mean, my first NSF grant was $8,000, and it lasted for 2 years. So it was a pretty cheap project, except for in terms of sort of my own time. The second set of your questions, though, I think about the technology tools themselves. One of the things I talk about, there's a sort of 9-point plan for high-tech equity at the end of the book, and one of the things I talk about is thinking about technology design in more sustainable ways. Because the kinds of things I brought up today aren't really the only social justice issues around technology, particularly in poor and working people's communities. So one of the, I think, when you take a global lens on it, one of the really important issues is disposal of toxic waste from the computer design process, the building process, and also from the disposal of it at the end. So I do think there's some really good work going on around computer take-back campaigns, and also campaigns to design computers in ways that are, they've gotten less and less upgradable as time has gone on. Like, for example, this is the thing I feel most guilty about this computer. If this computer breaks, they just pull off the computer part and throw it away and stick a new one on, right? So it's not like, oh, the hard drive has failed, take out the hard drive and put a new hard drive in. It's like, just throw away the computer and stick a new one on. So unfortunately, I think in the design world, we're going away from that, and we need to be going more towards these more sort of design for reuse strategies around technology. I'm not sure how to give that idea legs, though. There hasn't been a lot of luck around that, honestly.
Could I indicate that? By the way, fascinating insight into this empowerment of a local community involved in ICT. And it's just respectfully to suggest that there's an element here of what I would call political economy that needs to buttress this. That, of course, we're all aware that the United States is the most formidable market in the world. It's still familiar with an awesome military. It's one of the most successful examples of hands-led government. And could it be that this is the price one has to pay to have this sort of technology, which you can, in a sense, use to not quite subvert the capitalist system in the United States? So I think anybody would never do that, really. But really, to challenge it and to contest it. So perhaps, using the tools of the Apple Corporation to challenge what the Apple Corporation do, it could be a useful enterprise.
Right, but that's also Apple's marketing campaign, which makes me a little suspicious, right? So the 1984 ad where, you know, the Olympic runner throws the hammer through Big Brother, right? It's all about saying, like, we're not like that. You know, we're like weird and unique and quirky, and it clearly works. You know, like, here's my brand new Mac Air that I love, like, more than my pets, you know, which is, it's true and embarrassing and true. You know, I think they're incredibly sophisticated. I think they're deeply sophisticated. And I'm not sure that these are the tools, right? And going back to sort of my point about, you know, the relationship between Twitter and the Arab Spring, for example, there's a great critique from Tunisia and from Egypt that calling the Arab Spring the Twitter revolution is just an attempt by Americans to brand somebody else's revolution as like, oh, we did that, right? And I think that's fair. It's a fair critique. So I'm not sure that this is the tool. I think it can be part of a larger people's effort to shift that political economy, which I do think is happening, though is meeting with, you know, limited and uneven success.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Any folks? Yeah.
I was interested in your point on Paulo Freire. I mean, when you read some of his stuff, it's almost as though it's against everything for something that's hard to define. And when he's talking about the New York Education Board, it's kind of schools are fighting it against the youth. You know, in some way, you must have like Michael Gove with his free schools, his small schools, and things like that. I think there's probably the critical ideologies that they almost against everything for nothing. So you're always against the states, just against the kind of people who are actually providing welfare. So do you have any specific ideologies in mind that you're actually for, rather than just explore everything you want?
Okay, so I don't read myself as, it's interesting, thank you for that. I appreciate it, because I don't read myself as being actually terribly critical. I usually describe myself as like a hard-won optimist. I actually think there's a lot of room for positive change, and there's a lot of people making it. Fundamentally, what I'm for is that, you know, basic principles, like everybody's really smart, that people closest to problems have the best information about them and are most invested in making creating smart solutions, sustainable solutions for them, and that we're much smarter together than we are by ourselves. So that's like my fundamental sort of big three. I tend towards being involved in social change in my own context, right? Just because of the mode of organizing that I like is very much about starting where you live, about sort of, there's a Scandinavian history called dig where you stand history, which is basically the idea that if you just stand in one place and go down, you'll find out everything about the history of the world. I kind of feel like that about activism, that like if you stand in one place, that everything will cross you at some point. So my tendency is more about local empowerment, and is a little bit hard to pin down because I don't have sort of a very straightforward ideology of what that change should look like, because I don't know, right? I know I can be part of that, and that I can help open the space and facilitate the processes for that to happen. But it's not my agenda, right? And that's really kind of the point of, and I think that's the problem that a lot of people have with Freire too, is like, he doesn't have an agenda. Like, he's like, this method is really interesting and important social change, but he doesn't say, like, and you have to do A, B, and C, right? And I think because I come out of that tradition, that it's much more amorphous what my plan is, because my plan is to just continue to open the space so other people can speak about what their problems are and how to solve them.
Well, I think one problem, I'm going to start with the raising as an individual. Mm-hmm. Some of this plays very much into the hands of liberal consumerism, so we have the raising capacity, which is the individual, etc., etc. I think that's where you probably, in a very situated context, you start to almost lose the context power on a social, you lose the social. So I think that's something that's been there. So there's a discussion.
Yeah, so my experience actually has been that starting with the very local has very quickly led to big structural stuff. Like our analysis was always global, was always structural, and I don't think I have these slides with me. Let me see. No. No, I don't have it with me. But one of the things that I think is really interesting in the book is that when that drawing of the digital divide that I had. So I went into interviews with this drawing of the digital divide and said, like, what do you think about this as a way to describe this policy problem? And if this doesn't work for you, what works for you better? And almost instantly, people went to like big structural issues. So they were like, oh, this isn't it. This is like, basically, they didn't have the language for it, but they would describe it like, be like, oh, this is about capitalism. What? What do you mean? Or they'd be like, this is about, exploitation of labor, or this is about, and like, again, not using that language, but clearly that's where they were going. That's what they meant. And there's one of the chapters shows you all of those drawings and talks about that analysis. So I really felt like we went structural almost immediately, and you can do that from starting at the very local, but it's really important to meet people where they're at, to start where people are, and in terms of the material situation, in order for it to have relevance and meaning for people, and for people to invest in the process. It has to be their process. So thanks for that. Anything you already got to say something? See if somebody else is doing shine. Look away. No, you seem to be doing shine.
I'm doing shy. Your diagram is the digital divide. You've got the on the left that goes to the digital. Yeah. And then there's people like that. In the UK, I believe 6 million people don't have access to the internet. Now, do you see those people as digitally disenfranchised? Or are you arguing that actually they, just like everybody else, surrounded by the world, is digitally living they are?
That's a terrific question, and I think I'm really glad you brought it up, because sometimes I don't frame this as well as I should. I think access is completely and totally crucial, right? And to say that that it is not the only social justice issue is not to say that it isn't a social justice issue. In the U.S., there's a ton of people who have certainly no personal access to particularly high-speed broadband, but often no access at all, even in public libraries, right? So in New York City, it takes, you have to wait 40 minutes to get on a computer at a New York City public library. So I think that's an absolutely crucial baseline for thinking about this work. My problem or my critique is when that's where we stop it. Where we say like, oh, if I could get you in a room with a computer, we're done. And I just think it's such a small part of the overall relationship between technology and social justice that I just want to, and there's a lot of people talking about sort of digital disenfranchisement, and that's great, and they should continue to do it, but I want to just keep pushing the conversation to say like, okay, and if access, what for? And if access towards what? And if access, what else? So that we continue to have these sort of interesting, critical, and I think ultimately more productive conversations about technology and social justice. So, but thank you. I think it's really important to acknowledge that access is still a huge issue for a lot of people, and that it's absolutely based on class, race, and gender, and ways that are really getting the red card. I will be here all day, so feel free to come yell at me in person or tell me you're afraid. I prefer the second, but do whatever you feel like you need to do. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to the rest of it.